Thanks for being with us as we finish out a week here in the Gospel of John. We are in the 25th verse of chapter 6, and we need to just kind of connect a few dots here before we jump in. John has inserted a couple of stories, but this whole 6th chapter is really dominated by the discussion of the feeding of the 5,000, particularly the imagery of bread. And that's going to come up again today as Jesus moves toward a discussion with lots more of those implications. So if you remember, Jesus fed the 5,000, then he and the disciples left, the disciples first, then Jesus walks on water. Now Jesus is back. The crowds have followed him. And what we're getting today in this passage is Jesus having a conversation, which is almost a confrontation with the crowd. So I'll jump in here, verse 25, read down through, 33 or so, and then we'll come back for some discussion. When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, "Rabbi, when did you come here?" Jesus answered them, "I tell you the truth, you're looking for me, not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures for eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For it is on him that God the Father has set his seal." Then they said to him, "What must we do to perform the works of God?" Jesus answered, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent." So they said, "What sign are you going to give us that we may see it and believe you? What work are you performing? Our ancestors ate manna in the wilderness, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven." Jesus said to them, "I tell you the truth, it was not Moses who gave the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." So, again, we have one of these passages in John where there are misunderstandings and some rabbit trails, and John uses imagery to kind of help us get there. And in this case, bread. Jesus semi-critically says, you're following me for the wrong reasons. You came over here, but I don't think it's because you saw the signs and understand what you saw. I think it's because you got free bread and you want to be filled up again. And then Jesus occasions this conversation, don't work for food, but not for food that perishes, but for food that will last. And then the people get where the people in John typically go, well, show us a sign, validate what you're saying, which of course in John is always the wrong thing to say because Jesus is his own sign, and anyone who's paying attention should know that. And so Jesus then says, look, it's not about Moses, it's about what God does, and the bread that God gives is the bread that comes from heaven, clearly referencing himself. This is, not to steal next week's thunder, but this is all headed toward a place where Jesus is going to say, I am the bread of life. And so I think it helps to keep that destination in mind, maybe to see the through line here that we're getting. But, Michael, these are the moments that maybe John runs the risk of losing people because we do get these back and forth kind of dialogues. But clearly, Jesus' point here is essentially be motivated for the right things, for the right reasons, and again, don't ask for signs because you shouldn't need them.
Some small interesting details that you're going to find in the story, like verse 25, the first question that they ask, "Rabbi, when did you come here?" And you might remember that when Jesus was sort of coming across the lake, you remember that suddenly the boat ends up on the other side. We talked about sort of the mysterious circumstances of that. It's interesting that the crowd leads in with a question, "Hey, when did you get here?" Maybe more than just a narrative question. There may be a little bit of some spiritual significance in that, that Jesus has done this miracle, not just walking on the water after he fed the crowd, but that boat just suddenly moved, and now Jesus, how is it and when is it that you got here? And then Jesus, I think, very tellingly in the Gospel of John's account, Jesus makes it abundantly clear that he is seeing in this crowd not signs of faith, but rather signs of appropriation. That Jesus is going to be a great source of food and daily sustenance. He's going to be a good Messiah as had been expected. And I think that you're going to see that argument only continue when Jesus pushes back on that. And then the crowd says, well, our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness. And then Jesus turns this and says, no. It wasn't Moses who gave you that bread. It's the Father. And this is a theme, Clint, that John makes it clear to us that Jesus returned to often, was this theme of the fact that it's the Father who sends the Son, who gives his life for the world, and that ordering is essential. That's a theological proposition, that there is the Father and then there is the Son, and you have in that this triune kind of idea that if you understand that ordering, then you can understand what Jesus is teaching. Now, if you see Jesus for who he is, that becomes a gateway to revelation for who God is. And all of this flows one into the other.
And I think there's a sense in which Jesus is saying, as they say, show us a sign, and Moses gave us bread. I think there's a sense in which Jesus is asking them if they're paying attention. I mean, Jesus has just done that.
Yeah.
Jesus has just given them bread in the wilderness. Also, Michael, I think we have to be a little careful with this, because our Reformed theological tradition has made a significant debate between the idea of faith and works. But if you read this passage, there's a little bit of it here. They say, what do we have to do? What work do we have to do? And Jesus rather says, you have to believe. That if you believe, and please know that for John, believe doesn't just mean mentally accept something. It means to trust something and follow something and put one's faith in something. It doesn't just mean accept it as true. It means orient your life by it. And I think there's a sense in which Jesus says, if you do that, the works will take care of themselves. It isn't about what you have to do. So they say here, what must we do to perform the works of God? And Jesus says, this is the work, that you believe in him whom he has sent. And so I think there's a helpful lesson there for those of us who consider ourselves inside the faith, that yes, we are called to do the things of God, but those things, rather than being requirements in and of themselves, are the natural outcome of belief. And it is more important that we practice faith that bears fruit than that we try to cross off the list of works that are required of us. And that's not a main point of the passage, but I think given our lens as Reformed Christians, there is a sense in which we can see it in there.
There's also an aspect of belief connected to observation or proof. And John, with this language of sign, really, I think, emphasizes that. And we specifically see that here when Jesus in verse 26 says, I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw signs. In other words, that the bread that they ate, that the miracle that they literally took into themselves drew them outside of themselves to see the truth of who Jesus was. No, it's because you ate your fill of earthly bread, right? You filled your body and that felt good. That's why you're here. But then ultimately the crowd returns back to him in verse 30. What sign are you going to give us then? And at this point, I just imagine Jesus exasperated, right? Like, what sign am I going to give you? What more do you want me to do for you, right? Like, there is 12 baskets of food left over. The disciples just literally saw Jesus calm a storm. What more do you need to see the truth of who Jesus is? And I think that's a constant and kind of growing tension for Jesus. And I think, Clint, it does explain a little bit why Jesus's conflict with the crowds does increase so quickly and rapidly in the Gospel of John is because when Jesus does these things, John makes it clear every single one of these should be enough for the crowd to be tipped off to who Jesus is. And yet, repeatedly and consistently, the crowds don't get it. They're not there. And so then the question is ultimately, what would it take for us to believe? How much do we need to believe? To what extent do we need the miraculous to be able to see into life, to understand who Jesus is? And I think the sub-theological foundation in John, I don't know that this gets teased out explicitly many times, but I think it's there throughout the whole, is that the normal, the common, the physical, the stuff that we do every day is enough. If we but look with eyes of faith, if we allow ourselves to believe, suddenly that opens the door to understanding in a way that we could have never imagined otherwise. And I think John wants to make it clear it's not the fantastical displays that reveals who Jesus is, though there are signs to who he is. It's very much the one who sent him and the truth that he proclaims.
Yeah, I wonder if one could say that absent faith, there's never enough evidence to come to faith. But on the other side of faith, one is able to see evidence in abundance of who Jesus is. These crowds, the religious leaders, the Pharisees, Sadducees, etc., they see all the things Jesus does. But they've already decided something about who Jesus is, and so they miss what those things offer to teach them. And I'm not sure if that's the conversation we're having here with the crowd, but if one is looking for certainty, absent faith, or if one is looking for proof, absent faith, I think you won't find that in the gospel, and I certainly think you won't find it in the Gospel of John. It is the conviction of who Jesus is affirmed by what Jesus does, but it's, I think, fundamentally an act of belief. I mean, that's the word that John will come back to over and over and over again. And interestingly enough, evidence generally doesn't lead to belief. But once one believes, they will see myriad evidence that affirms what it is that they see in Christ.
Well, and the crowd's response to this, I think, is striking. In my Bible, I've got the red letters here. So look at the little black lettered section here in verse 34. They said to him, "Sir, give us this bread always." I think that is just written by John. This is so John. This is such a beautiful encapsulation of the misunderstanding of the spiritual truth. I mean, Clint, let's be honest. If you're a literalist and you want to read Jesus's teaching literally, you will be like the crowd and always confused in the Gospel of John, right? Like, yes, okay, the bread of God is sent from God himself. We want more of that, Jesus. Like, hey, we finally got you back on the same page. Now we're talking about bread again. And the moment that the crowd does that, it, on one hand, I do think displays their lack of understanding. But in a way, Clint, there's also a kind of generous moment here in that though the crowd doesn't understand the subtleties of what Jesus is teaching them, the request, "Give us this bread always," is the hope of the gospel. That's also a deep, deep kind of first step into the faith. Even if they do mean the physical bread, or even if they continue to misunderstand, there's enough interpretive space and room that John has given us that maybe inviting the bread always is the first step, that ginger first, just tiny little edging into what God might have to reveal us. And that Jesus, though he does get into this kind of conflict with the crowds, he's always yet still leading them. He's always inviting them. And there's a kind of graciousness even when you see a phrase like that.
And we've seen this before, the misunderstandings with Nicodemus. How can a person be born from above? The woman at the well. This is very much patterned on the conversation with the woman at the well. There's living water. Well, give me that living water because then I won't have to come out here with a bucket.
Yeah.
John loves those kind of misunderstandings, and I think John loves to leave the reader pondering over earthly questions that have heavenly implications. Give us this bread. We, the reader, know that they don't know what they're asking, but they are asking the right question. They're making the right request. They just don't understand what it is. And I think John does that purposefully, because the idea is that that's what we would say too. But rather than talking about physical bread, we would be talking about what Jesus is talking about, what Jesus is trying to communicate, a spiritual nourishment and eternal bread of life, as he's about to call it. So, yeah, I think those stories are well loved in John. The misunderstanding, which leads to Jesus stating a truth that people don't quite understand. They're close, but they're not quite there, which leaves the reader asking, well, what do I understand?
Very, very briefly here at the end, just verse 33, notice how John repeats these themes so consistently throughout the book. This sounds a lot like John 3:16 if you take a step back. The bread of God is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to what? To the world. There's this consistency in the teachings of John. Yes, it's spiritual teaching. Yes, it can be easy to get caught on autopilot. Yes, I think there's moments where the book does feel like it gets bogged down, especially as we get further into it. But Clint, yet there's a consistent theme throughout it. John 3:16 is not an accident of the book. It's not somehow, a thing that just for a short moment glows brightly. No, I think it is woven throughout this book that God's the one who proactively sends, and God sends for the purpose of saving who? The world. God's intention, God's direction, God's plan is central to this book, and it never changes. It's rooted at the core.
And the mechanism being those who believe, those who come to trust Christ, experience the salvation that God hopes or intends for the world. So, John 3:16 is a very good foundation to keep in mind, I think, when you interact with this book.
Okay, well, thanks for being with us, friends. Hopefully there's been something here today that's encouraging, challenging, that has given you pause. I certainly like this video. If that's true, it helps others find the study and have that moment for themselves. And do subscribe so you can stick with us on studies like this. Grateful to all of you who have subscribed. It's crazy. We've crossed 1,100 as of the making of this video. So thank you for being with us. We will see you next week.
Have a good weekend.